My first memories of Wembley are living in North Wembley, where I grew up, and the reason I grew up in North Wembley was that my father, Teddy Fader, worked in these studios. He started here in 1955 working for Rediffusion Television. He'd been a very unhappy merchant working in a merchant bank, and he found an advert in a newspaper for the new independent television network that was going to be starting, and he applied and got a job here with a job title video operator, I'm not quite sure how it was pronounced, but fundamentally a cameraman. And he started on this site in 1955, and he moved to the area shortly after with my mother, and I was born in 1959, just around the corner. And I have early memories of him coming home on his motorbike, and he used to come home for lunch. That was how easy it was living so locally. I didn't visit these studios myself until I came to work here many years later. London Weekend won the franchise for the weekend London ITV area in 1968, and they took over on this site and from Rediffusion, and my father was temporarily unemployed when Rediffusion lost the franchise, but was then re-employed by London Weekend. By that stage he was a lighting director, so he continued to work on this site until the move to the South Bank some years later. So my connection goes right back to birth, through Rediffusion, through to London Weekend, and then onwards from there. I started as a trainee camera operator at London Weekend. Nepotism might spring to mind. I hope I got it on my own merits, but my father was still working at London Weekend when I joined as well. He was a lighting director, and I joined as a trainee camera operator back in 1978, working up in the South Bank. I worked my way through the camera department for about 10 years and progressed to operating, and I then felt I'd reached as far as I could get there, and I happened to hear that Limehouse were relocating from Docklands and had purchased the Wembley studios from Lee Brothers, or Lee International I think as they were called, and it just looked at it as a good move for me to make, to come and look after the camera department here. And I applied for the job in 1989 and got the job, and worked on this site for about 3 years until sadly Limehouse went into liquidation. Limehouse started out as an idea of some ex-Southern Television employees. Southern TV lost the ITV franchise to TVS, and at the time they were looking for an opportunity to set up, find a new career potentially, and with the start of Channel 4, independent production was beginning to look more viable. It wasn't all in-house at the BBC and ITV, and the opportunity to run an completely independent studio seemed a good idea. The other element, and why they found the Limehouse site in Docklands, was that the area was still very run down. So the Docklands Development Agency provided a number of incentives for new businesses coming into the area, and so that was how the site was originally chosen, and in fact how the name came about, because it was the Limehouse Wharf, Docklands area. As with a number of businesses, things went very well initially, but there were huge times where there were gaps in usage of the studio, and finances proved to be difficult with the funding that they had. And Trillion, an outside broadcast and other business, came in and purchased the studios. It was very fortuitous for Trillion that they did that, because very shortly afterwards the site was compulsorily purchased and became the site of the Canary Wharf Tower. And the purchase price, we understand, was around about £25 million, which went into Trillion's coffers. And so at that point the original Limehouse building was lined up for demolition some 6 months later. I think Limehouse was very well respected as a company. It provided a truly independent studio facility, which was very new to the market, particularly on the scale. The studios were of a good size. The facilities, the installation was to a high standard, and it was crewed with a lot of particularly ITV crew in cameras, sound and lighting and so on. So production-wise, the quality of production that came out of there was very good and to a very high standard. Partially perhaps was the downfall of the business, or what caused the business to get into some difficulties, because no expense was spared in certain areas, and as we all know, subsequently that can cause problems. The Limehouse studios in the Docklands era were well known for entertainment programmes, and particularly for some of the more sort of the youth element. There was a particular show called Network 7, which they produced for Jane Hewland's company, and this was the beginning of really using different technology, a lot of handheld camera work, different camera angles, using different parts of the studio, not just being inside the studio, taking cameras outside, running around into offices, control rooms and so on. And it was the beginning of a sort of a slightly newer generation of more youth-orientated production. But equally they did a number of, a lot of Channel 4 work, including Spitting Image, and a number of the early series of Spitting Image were recorded there. And the beginnings of Hat-Trick Productions were beginning, they were just starting to appear, and they did a number of those. So I think light entertainment was probably an area they were particularly prevalent in, although they did shoot dramas there too, but certainly the entertainment and the beginnings of sort of the newer generation of youth entertainment was starting to come out of there. I think it was viewed as a sort of a trendy and quite innovative and different place to work, and this was sort of added to that their hospitality was a boat moored in the Docklands area called the sloop John D, I believe, and I think some of the sort of after show parties and similar were legendary on that boat. The immediate problem that Limehouse had when they came to leave the Docklands site was that they were working on a production called Business Daily for Channel 4. So the key element was finding new premises to house that operation. Now that didn't need a very big studio, and also with Trillion's other connections with other businesses, they also wanted some post-production facilities. So they found a site in the Trocadero building in Piccadilly, and that had a suitable studio space, or a space that could be made into a studio for the Business Daily. The Business Daily was a daily morning magazine show with ENG inserts and interviews, business orientated. And so it needed a fairly simple studio setup which could be established fairly quickly, and post-production and graphics facilities were put in. But this was really just an interim to solve that issue of servicing that production. So the company still had the ambition to keep running a large studio operation, and so they started looking around for suitable premises, and that's when they found the Wembley site, which had been home to Lee International Studios. I started at Limehouse Wembley in 1989, towards the end of 1989, and the company had acquired the site some 5 or 6 months earlier. And before I started, a number of the older Lee studios had been demolished. A number of them had the inevitable asbestos in them and were in a pretty derelict state. I don't think Lee's had used them much in the interim years, and some of them dated back a long time prior to that. So most of those outbuildings were demolished, and just remaining was what we still called Studio 5A and B from the Rediffusion and London Weekend days. The benefit was we had a massive parking area, or the demo site, the demolition site as we used to call it, which was very useful. So when I first started, when I joined to look after the camera department, Wembley was still not in any way finished, and we were working on other productions still at the Trocadero, and it took many months more to get the studio finished. However, a lot of work was done in key areas, particularly on the studio floor, and a lot of money was spent putting a properly laser leveled studio floor down, which to my mind as a camera operator was hugely important. There were some challenges because where the dividing door operates, there had to be expansion joints put in, and there was a lot of talk about how that was best achieved if cameras were going to have to track over those joints. But it was pretty well done, and I think has served on for many years since. We had a target to aim for. We had a production for a Japanese company, and it was a music show similar to Top of the Pops, which was called Hit Studio International, and we had a deadline to produce the first live show in a few months hence, so we had a target to work towards to get everything in place. It all went really pretty well, amazingly. There was a delay putting in the control rooms, which was the major issue. So the deadline was hit, but an outside broadcast truck had to be used for the first live music show. But all the lighting gantry and elements were in place, and so it was a very good start. But I do remember turning up here and thinking, this is a building site still. But it was remarkable how quickly things were turned round, and a studio started to emerge. Limehouse also had the ambition to want to go for some innovation and new technology, and they were targeting the satellite broadcasters too, Sky and the long demised BSB, who used a now sort of apocryphal dish which was called the squareal because it was sort of square in its shape of a satellite dish, and they used component technology in their video transmission, and Limehouse installed a fully component control room and had a fully component outside broadcast truck targeting specifically that market. Sadly, BSB, the take up on the BSB squareal for various reasons was poor, although the picture quality was extremely good, and sadly a lot of the investment, it could be argued, was misspent. But it did mean that the studios were certainly equipped to a very high standard for the time, technically. We were very fortunate because we did work on a huge variety of shows here at Wembley in the Limehouse era. I have particular memories of the now infamous The Word. This again, I think, continued on the sort of the youth programming that had sort of perhaps started over in the Docklands period. It certainly was a very wild and unpredictable live show, and it was you just never knew what was going to happen. A very lively audience, a lot of music, a lot of very strange things going on. But it was, whatever one thinks about it, it was different, it was new, and it certainly caused a lot of interest. And to actually be involved in it, on camera, with it all going on around you, was absolutely brilliant. I mean, some weeks you couldn't believe what you were seeing, and you couldn't believe this could be transmitted on live television. And it did cause a huge uproar, but great interest and notoriety, which is exactly what was wanted, made household names of certain people who went on to do a lot of different things in their careers. In sort of contrast to that, we had some other just gloriously enjoyable shows like Food and Drink, which couldn't have been more polar opposite, really. A lovely food magazine program with wonderful presenters who were so professional. It was a classic BBC production, really. Very talented production team, very hard working, very smooth, always went to time, and in some ways those sort of contrasts were brilliant. You know, one day you could be working on something like that, and then something just completely unpredictable and not knowing what was going to happen, and very exciting. And a lot in between. We did, probably drama was the least sort of genre that we did here, but another thing that was very good was the start of Hat-Trick Productions. And they were a very firm believer in Limehouse, and they brought a lot of their productions here. And we did a number of series of Whose Line Is It Anyway, shows with Harry Enfield, Paul Merton, and of course the one that amazingly is still going, and I believe is in its 50th series, was Have I Got News For You? And the pilot for Have I Got News For You was shot in the Wembley studios, and then subsequently the first probably 7 or 8 series were shot here as well. One of the productions I do remember very vividly was the start of a series of shows that was very successful actually, and it was the first one that we did here, and it was for MTV, and it was the Unplugged series, and it was musicians just doing away with all the amplification, just doing acoustic sets. And we had Paul McCartney in with his, at the time he had most of his band Wings with him, but it was a predominantly acoustic set for MTV, and it was one of those where you just felt you're definitely in the presence of someone very special here, and the music was amazing, and it was, again, because it was something a little bit different that hadn't been done, and of course subsequently went on to be something that a huge number of artists did for MTV. But I believe that was one of the very first ones that was done here, and it was, I was lucky enough to be doing a handheld camera right in amongst the proceedings, and just being that close to the action and watching Paul McCartney at work, you did sort of think this is very special. And it was also quite interesting because it linked right back to the early days here in Wembley as well, when they used to appear on Ready Steady Go back in the rediffusion days, and right in the early heydays in the 60s of the Beatles. And I thought that was quite an interesting thought. All those years had passed, but here again was Paul McCartney. I remember that very vividly. The one production I felt I slightly missed out on, I was rather disappointed, was that I have to confess to being a bit of a closet Rick Astley fan, and he came and shot video, one of his later pop videos in Studio B, and I didn't even know it was going on. We were working on another show in Studio A, and we'd heard that there was a pop video being shot, and that would have been a really nice show to have worked on, but it was all shot on film as a four-waller, and it was a later one, Cry for Help, that Rick Astley did here. Brilliant track, and it's a lovely video actually. It's well worth the look, and that was shot here in Wembley, and I would have loved to have manned a film camera for a change on that, but I think I was probably sadly doing something else in Studio B, which I've forgotten. I have very fond memories of working here at Wembley in the Limehouse era. It was very exciting. We had a great in-house crew. We also had a lot of freelancers coming in, and we all felt we forged friendships and relationships with all the people that came through the door in that period. It was a good time. It was still fairly early days of production outside of the BBC and ITV, and the sort of slightly less rigid sort of feel of working here in Limehouse was often commented upon. Working at Wembley was a different experience from being at ITV or at TV Centre, where things were perhaps just a little bit more formal and rigid. And so we used to find that the feedback was always very good. And I think the starting of that procedure of a mixture of in-house crew and freelancers really worked extremely well. And I think it was a very professional place to work too. Technical standards were high. A lot of money was spent on equipment, and fairly soon after we started we upgraded to new Sony cameras, when we were the first studio to actually use that particular, it was a Sony BVP 370p, and it was the first of that era of Sony camera, and gave us a very good head start technically. And I think it was it was very exciting. It was lively. There were a lot of inevitable good end of series parties. There was a great little bar here which was frequented by staff and guests and helped the atmosphere along many a time. And I think a lot of people do have very happy memories of those 3 years. I think one of the key things about Wembley Studios, and particularly when you're working on a production where the door is up and you're using the huge studio, and this is the same for the Limehouse days and the Fountain days, is that I think the production company always felt like they were special because they were the only production company on site, and you had that ability to embrace them and embrace the whole show, and everyone's effort was concentrated on that production. I think going back, looking at it, if you went into ITV or BBC at the same era, you would be one of many shows and many crew working on different productions, and I think the focus of working on the one production really contributed to the spirit and made it a very good environment to work in. I think my key memories of working at Wembley are of how special a place it is actually. The Limehouse era was a bit like a firework. It burned very bright and then fizzed out a short time afterwards. It really was a very brief period. It really was 3 years, and that went very, very quickly. But it was such an exciting place to be, and a lot of that was down to fellow team members and working with people coming in. I mean, it even goes down to remembering people like Jim, who worked here, who was, as we called him, head of Bogs and Boilers and the Door, and his local knowledge of the site was just so important. And I believe he'd stayed on from the Lee days, and he was the only person who knew all the intricacies of the building, and a truly eccentric character. And I can remember him getting his air rifle and picking off pigeons that were nesting in the roof area, to the huge horror of the receptionist Tina at the time, who came running in screaming, saying, "Jimmy's shooting the pigeons, someone stop him." I think the other thing that is just extraordinary about this building is the famous door, the dividing door between the studios. And I think when I first came here, the door was halfway up because they were working on putting the resin floor down. And I just remember walking in and standing in between it and looking up at it and just thinking, how could this have been built? How does it actually work? And I can remember then the huge anxiety when we did have to put it up or drop it down in order to do a production the next day. And the going up and looking at how it operated and just being astounded that this was technology from 1959, and how it relied on one chap who actually knew which buttons he had to press just to make sure the door was dropping evenly, even though it was meant to have all the sensors that worked on that. This was very old technology, but amazingly, we only had one instance that I can remember where there was the dreaded cry, "The door's stuck!" And one door had come down a bit further than the other, and it had stopped. And we knew we had a production in the next day in both studios. So it was, okay, how are we going to do this? And suitably, Jim, the extraordinary character who didn't know which button to press or which cable to wiggle or wire to pull, got it down. And but a truly unique feature in a TV studio, and quite defining for this place. When Limehouse and Trillium went into receivership, I left. That was at the end of 1992, and the only real option for me as a camera operator was to go freelance, which I did, and was lucky enough to pick up a lot of the hat trick work as a freelancer. And the pleasing thing was that a number of the shows came back to Wembley under the new ownership of Fountain Studios, and it was always a great treat actually to come back and to see the building as I remembered it, but also to see all the changes that Fountain made and all the improvements and updates and what have you, particularly to the canteen area, which has always been a very strong element of working here at Fountain. And I think there was a great feeling that Fountain had continued on really what Limehouse had started, but did it a lot better and a lot more securely really, and with it, again, improved technical facilities. But I can remember coming back and doing a lot of shows here, including things like Test the Nation and the Kumars, and numerous shows, a lot of music, and all sorts of programs here, and always a great pleasure to come back. So I was very fortunate to continue the sort of relationship with Wembley Studios through my freelance career as a camera operator, and then subsequently as I've gone on to run a rental business for camera equipment, particularly pedestals and tripods and heads, and we rent equipment to Fountain for programs like Britain's Got Talent and the X Factor. So after leaving Limehouse and becoming freelance, I worked as a camera operator for a long time, which I really enjoyed, but felt there might be something a little bit more, and I did tend to find the long working hours sometimes a little bit punishing, and the late nights and the weekend working. And so with a couple of other cameramen, we set up a small rental business, which we fundamentally ran from a mobile phone and a van and a small lock-up. And we bought up second-hand camera equipment, camera pedestals, mainly Vinton camera pedestals and tripods, heads and similar equipment. And it was always rather pleasing to sometimes hire the equipment back to programs that we were working on as freelancers ourselves. And the business grew reasonably well, and it reached the point where we were able to do less freelance work and spend more time growing the rental business. And that suited me at the time because I wasn't just finding the late hours and the long working a little bit punishing, as I've said, and allowed me a bit more time at home. And subsequently the business was purchased by Vinton's parent company, and so we run the rental operation for the Vitek group, which is Vinton, Sackler and O'Connor, AutoCue, Autoscript's parent company. So we run the rental business from Twickenham, and we supply other TV studios, but particularly outside broadcast companies. And as I said, always a pleasure when we can hire equipment back to Fountain for productions here. One of the key elements of Wembley is this massive studio space. The famous door in the raised position just creates such a huge open working space, and fully equipped with lighting barrels and all studio facilities on tap. Something that's really quite rare, and certainly on this scale. There are four-wallers, but they just don't offer the flexibility or the speed of installation, of getting shows in and out that can be done in this amazing studio at Wembley. And it has obviously been able to house some of the biggest productions on British television. Inevitably you come back to the X Factor and to Britain's Got Talent, but the spectacle of those shows is something new to some degree. Yes, we've had a lot of entertainment shows, but the scale of something like X Factor being achieved in a studio environment is quite something, and the quality of the lighting that can be achieved because of the facilities here. Again, this isn't something that's easy to just achieve in a full wall setup, and it has defined the way we look at shiny floor shows, I think, on television, and has moved the art on, I genuinely believe. And again, this is a huge disappointment to see this facility and the ability to do that sort of show in that way disappear. And I think, again, I can only say that I think the business and the industry is poorer for losing those facilities in key central London areas. My working life in the business has been very studio orientated. I've done outside broadcast work, but a lot of the time I've spent in studios, and I've been lucky enough to work in all the major London studios and those further out, Pinewood, Shepperton and beyond. I've always really enjoyed working at the studios here in Wembley. And I just think it's a huge disappointment to see a very viable business closed down for reasons that are not really television related. It's clearly the pressure of building values of plots in the London area. And you just have this awful feeling that television production, and particularly large studios, are just being pushed out completely from the London area. And I think the business is poorer for it, particularly for audience shows, access for just people working. It throws up all sorts of problems, and it just seems very short term to me, the decision making sometimes that's going on, and in particular in the case of Wembley. This is a great site, it's a fantastic facility, and we'll never see anything like it again, and it just seems kind of tragic is the word I'm afraid to have to use, that it's going. And to see the lack of studio space in London is a real blow to the industry, I believe. If I had to sum up my thoughts about Wembley Studios, bearing in mind that my connection with it goes right back to birth, if you like, and through my father, and wonderful memories of my father, who also was lucky enough to have a fantastic career in television as a cameraman and lighting director. And I know he was very happy working here in his days at Wembley and Rediffusion and London Weekend. So if I had to sum up my feelings about the studio, I would say it's the happiest place I've ever worked. If I could only use one word about this building and my connection with it, for me, it's lifelong.